One of the examples of the reliability of the Bible is about having the names written in the New Testament that we can date back to the first century and to the geographical locations where the Bible is written. Listen to Wes Huff explaining this.
With these non-commodity texts then, and you've got these different Gnostic Gospels, for example, one of the things I find interesting is that we're here in Egypt, and it's actually Egyptian names that you find in the text. Explain that, like what's going on, and how does that actually help us date those texts?
Yeah, when we're reading, say, the Gospel of John, we're getting names, or the Gospels or Acts, we're getting names and we're getting places that are in the geographical areas and are most frequent in first century Roman-occupied Palestine.
For example, you're getting Jewish names in the book of John or in the early Gospels. These are names that would date to that time frame in that area.
Yeah, not just names that were Jewish and that were being used in that time, but names that were popular within those particular decades that they're writing.
A series of scholarly studies has shown that, though Jews were located in many places across the Roman Empire, people's names often tended to be geographically located. By observing literary and archaeological artifacts, a list of common names can be clearly identified. By narrowing down the most popular names in places that Jesus lived, traveled, and ministered, and by comparing these to the list from the studies, an interesting correlation can be seen. Just as we see today with popular names, a qualifier or nickname is often used. For example, notice that when Matthew lists the disciples in his gospel, certain names have a qualifier or nickname and others do not. Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. As we would expect, the most popular names are those that have an added description. When we compare the most popular names in Judea and Galilee during the first century with names we see listed in key places in the biblical Gospels, we find that all the names with qualifiers match with what we'd assume if they were actually written in the time and place they claim to be narrating. In contrast, the Gospel of Judas only has two names that would fit, Jesus and Judas, but contains a host of other characters whose names match not with first century Judea or Galilee, like the biblical Gospels, but with names that were popular in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Consider how difficult it would be for someone living outside of the locations and times that these events took place to get the right names with the right qualifiers. We have 4 biblical Gospels, with 4 different authors, and yet each gets this test of naming frequency and attribution right every time. A test and standard that the non-biblical Gospels simply do not pass.
You know, we might think that that's easy to try to come up with, but if I told you, Andy, that I wanted you to forge, don't do this, it's morally ambiguous, but forge a document, say from 17th century France. I mean, you know some French names. Jean-Claude.
Not a lot.
Okay. Jean-Claude, Francois.
Jacques Cousteau.
Right. What are the chances, though, you forged that document on my behalf and you got the exact names that were right in that century in France, or even in like a city like Paris? I want you to forge this document from 17th century Paris. Well, that's actually a lot harder than you might think, because names change in popularity from decade to decade, even year to year. And the interesting thing is, when we look at the Gospels and Acts, we find that the popularity of those names in those geographical areas, in those centuries and decades, corresponds exactly to what we should be seeing if that is exactly when it was written.
So we hear Wes Huff making the case that if we look at the writers of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then we can see that the names that they use in their document can be traced back to the 1st century. So to determine if the source is reliable and is from the 1st century, one of the examples that you can use is, are the names that are being used, are these 1st century names? Are these popular names that we can trace back to the 1st century? Or are they popular names from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, or whatever century. And you can do the same with naming the cities, and the Bible also passes that test. So the argument for the reliability of the Bible, one of them is that the names that we can read in the New Testament, and especially in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can trace those names back to the 1st century, which makes the document, the Gospels, in that case, reliable. So to make a comparison, if we look at the Gospel of Judas, we see that the names that are being written in that Gospel is traced back to the 2nd century. So based on the names of those documents, we can make sure that the Gospel of Jude isn't from the 1st century, and therefore we reject it because it's not an eyewitness. It's just a Gnostic document. Someone else wrote it and perverted that writing into something that they prefer, that they like. They want to change what God said into their own image or their own vision. So Christians always knew that they should reject those writings, and that's why they were never in the Bible in the first place. And again, this gives credibility to the claim that the Bible is reliable, an accurate document from the 1st century. To know more about this, keep watching my videos, but also go to Wes Huff's YouTube channel. He has way more subscribers and he can explain it way better than I can. And he's a scholar also, and he just debated someone else, Billy Carson, and he just demolished the claims of Billy Carson in his debate, and it's a must watch. So credits to Wes Huff. And if you want to know more about the reliability of the Bible, keep watching my videos, keep watching the videos of Wes Huff and so many other scholars. That being said, I want to thank you for watching this video. My name is Aaron and this was Arentainment, and I see you in the next video.